Chapter 2. Something in the Garden. There is a particular relationship between a person and soil that has no adequate word in English. Other languages have tried. The Japanese have a concept for the specific comfort of being close to the earth. The Norwegians have words for the quality of outdoor air that restores something in you. But English, which has words for almost everything, doesn't have a precise word for the thing that happens when a person who loves growing things gets their hands into good soil for the first time. The closest approximation is probably home, but that word is already doing too much work and can't carry this specific meaning without losing something. Hermione Parker had been a gardener since she was 7 years old, when her grandmother in New Mexico had given her a 3-foot square of earth beside the back porch and said, simply, "This part is yours." She had grown up understanding, in the wordless way children understand things that become foundational, that the relationship between a person and a piece of earth they tend is one of the most honest relationships available to a human being. The earth does not perform. It does not manage impressions or curate what it shows you. You put something in it, and either it grows or it doesn't, and either way the earth tells you the truth about why. She had carried this understanding through every apartment and every rented room and every space that wasn't quite hers, through the years of window boxes and grow lights, and the one heroic attempt at a balcony garden in the Charlotte apartment that had produced, against considerable odds, 14 tomatoes and a genuinely impressive quantity of basil. Through all of it, the actual earth, the ground, the real thing, a piece of soil that was hers to tend for more than a season, had been the thing she was moving toward without always knowing it. She had stood at the kitchen window on their first evening and looked at the backyard and felt it with a clarity that was almost physical. This is what I've been waiting for. She waited 4 days before she started. Not because she was restrained. Patience was not, generally, Hermione's most prominent quality, but because there was furniture to arrange and curtains to hang, and a bathroom situation that needed addressing and a shimmer in the steering wheel of the truck that had graduated from concerning to actively alarming and needed Ron's attention before it became a crisis. There were the ordinary logistics of a new life to attend to first. But on the morning of the 5th day, she woke before Ron, dressed quietly in the dark, made coffee, and took it outside. The backyard in the early morning was different from the backyard in the afternoon light she'd been assessing it in from the kitchen window. The afternoon light was warm and revealing. It showed you what was there. The early morning light was different. It showed you what was possible. She stood on the back porch with her coffee and looked at it for a long time. The grass needed cutting. The fence along the south side was in decent shape, but the north fence had a section that had come away from its posts and leaned at a comfortable diagonal, held up mainly by the blackberry canes that had colonized it over what looked like several seasons of neglect. The forsythia by the shed was enormous, 15 years of growth at minimum, a dense rounded mass that had long since stopped being a shrub and was making a credible argument for being considered a small tree. In the far left corner, evidence of a previous garden, raised beds, collapsed now, the lumber rotted to softness, but the soil inside them still dark and distinct from the surrounding grass, still remembering what it had been used for. In the far right corner, the corner she kept coming back to, the apple tree stood there in the morning light with its last few fruits, dark red and small, and beneath it the ground had a quality that she found herself wanting to walk to the way you walk toward a fire in a cold room, drawn by something that wasn't quite warmth but was related to warmth. A density of presence, a richness. She set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and walked across the grass in the morning cool, her breath just barely visible, the dew cold through her garden shoes, and stood at the edge of that corner and looked down. The soil here was darker than the rest of the yard, not just the ordinary variation of shadowed ground, genuinely darker, the deep almost black of soil that is extremely rich in organic material that has been building itself for a long time. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against it the way her grandmother had taught her, not digging, just receiving, just listening. It was warm. Not dramatically, not a heat that would have been remarkable if she'd encountered it anywhere else, but warm in the way that living things are warm, in the way that the soil in a healthy, active garden is warm when it is full of biological activity, full of the quiet, industrious work of decomposition and regeneration that is always happening in good earth. She stayed crouched there with her palm on the soil for a moment. Then she stood up, went back to the porch, finished her coffee, and went to the shed to find the tools. The shed had been partly cleaned out by the previous owners, but not entirely. There were the usual residual items that people leave when they move, the things not worth taking and not worth disposing of, the flotsam of a domestic life. A rusted trowel, a coil of garden hose with a crack in it, 3 terracotta pots of graduated sizes, the largest one broken cleanly in half, a can of something that had once been spray paint and was now empty and had been for what looked like years. On a shelf above the workbench, a row of seed packets, empty, arranged with a neatness that suggested they had been kept there intentionally rather than simply forgotten. Hermione looked at the seed packets for a moment, read the labels. Tomatoes, beans, squash, marigolds, ordinary kitchen garden varieties, the kind you find at any hardware store. She wondered briefly about the person who had planted them, what their garden had looked like, whether they had harvested what they'd grown. She found behind the workbench what she was looking for, a full-sized spade, slightly rusty on the blade but with a solid handle, and a garden fork in similar condition. She carried them both out into the yard. She started in the far right corner. The first hour was clearing. She worked from the fence line inward, cutting back the long grass with the spade's blade in broad sweeping strokes, exposing the soil beneath in strips. The work had the quality that good physical work always has, the complete absorption of attention into the immediate task, the body doing what it knows, and the mind going quiet in the way it goes quiet for almost nothing else. She was aware of the morning warming around her, of the birds in the apple tree, of the sound of the creek below the road, of the particular smell of turned earth that is one of the best smells in the world. She worked steadily for an hour without thinking about anything in particular. Then she hit something. The spade went into the soil cleanly. She had developed a rhythm, a clean downward push and a slight twist and a lift, and then stopped. Not the resistance of a stone, which she'd encountered twice already and which had a particular hard, unyielding quality. This was different. A dull, dense resistance, slightly hollow-sounding when she pressed the spade against it, like something enclosed. She worked around it carefully, freed the soil on 4 sides of it with the spade's edge, going slowly, the way you go slowly when you're not sure what you're dealing with. It took about 10 minutes to clear enough earth around it to see what it was. A pot. Ceramic, small, roughly the size you'd use for a medium houseplant, maybe 8 inches across. Black glazed, or had been black once. The glaze had aged and crazed and in places had come away entirely, exposing the clay beneath. Sealed at the top with what appeared to be wax, dark, old, cracked in places but largely intact, covering the opening completely. Hermione sat back on her heels and looked at it. It had been buried, not dropped, not lost, not covered by the ordinary accumulation of soil over time. Buried deliberately at a depth that meant intention. Placed. She could see the way the soil had been disturbed and then replaced around it, the ghost of the digging in the density and color of the earth, though that disturbance was old, decades old, she estimated, looking at how thoroughly the surrounding soil had reknit itself around the intrusion. She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Later she would think about this moment. She would come back to it many times, turning it over, examining it from different angles, trying to understand what she had and hadn't known in that moment. Whether there had been something, some signal, some instinct, some version of the wordless knowing she usually trusted, that she had overridden or ignored. She didn't think there had been. She would be honest about this. There was nothing in that moment, crouching in the dirt of her own backyard in the morning light with a black pot in front of her, that felt like danger. It felt like a discovery. It felt like the ordinary archaeology of an old property, the things that accumulate in the earth of a place where people have lived, the objects and remnants and buried things that are always there if you dig deep enough. It felt like something interesting. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The wax seal was intact enough that there was a lid. She could see the seam now, held without effort. She turned it over in her hands, looking at it from all sides. The glaze, where it remained, had a depth to it, not the flat black of paint, but the complex layered black of old ceramic glaze, with undertones of blue and brown visible at certain angles. Someone had made this carefully. Not mass-produced, not a standard garden pot. Made. She carried it to the back porch and set it on the boards and went inside to get a knife. The wax seal came away in pieces, old and dry. It crumbled more than cut, falling away from the rim in dark fragments. She worked carefully around the circumference and then lifted the lid. Inside, coiled on a nest of what had once been fabric, degraded now to a fine brownish fiber, the original material completely transformed by decades of slow decomposition, was a necklace. She lifted it out and held it in the morning light. Silver, or had been silver, tarnished now to a dark gray that was almost black, the surface of it rough with oxidation. A chain, fine-linked, and suspended from it a locket. Oval, about the size of a large coin. The surface of the locket was engraved. She could feel the pattern under her fingertips, floral, vines, and small flowers, though the tarnish had filled the engraved lines and made the pattern difficult to see. She turned it over. On the back, in an area of the tarnish that was slightly less complete, she could make out letters. An engraving. She tilted it toward the light and read. LM. Always and only. She looked at the locket for a moment. Then she pressed her thumbnail into the seam at the side. There was a small catch, barely visible, which she freed with a fingernail, and the locket opened. Inside were two oval spaces. On the right side, where photographs were typically kept in lockets of this style and era, there was a photograph. Small, slightly faded, the tones of it shifted toward yellow and brown by time, but still clear, still entirely readable. It was a young woman. Late teens or early 20s, it was difficult to be certain. Dark hair, parted in the center, worn close to her head in the style of the early 1940s. A dark dress with a light collar. She was standing. The photograph was taken from the front, slightly formal, the kind of portrait photograph that people had taken in studios in that era. She was looking directly at the camera. This was the detail that Hermione registered first and would remember afterward with a precision she couldn't account for the quality of the woman's gaze. In formal portrait photographs of that era, people often looked slightly to the side, or at a point just above the lens, in the conventional posture of the posed portrait. This woman was looking directly into the camera, directly at whoever was holding it, with an intensity of attention that made the small, faded, decades-old photograph feel immediately present in a way that formal portraits rarely felt. Her eyes were large, dark, the kind of eyes that photographs of that era didn't usually capture well, that the photographic technology of the 1940s tended to flatten, to reduce to simple dark marks. But these eyes, even in the faded, time-altered image, even at this small scale, had a quality that resisted reduction. They were looking at Hermione with an attention that seemed almost impossible for a photograph, taken 80 years ago by someone who had no way of knowing who would eventually open this locket. On the left side of the locket, where a second photograph or a lock of hair was sometimes kept, there was nothing. The space was empty except for a faint discoloration in the metal, the ghost of something that had once been there and was now gone. Hermione looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the locket. She sat on the back porch in the morning light with the necklace in her hands, feeling the chain run between her fingers, feeling the weight of the locket at the end of it. The tarnished silver was warm from her handling of it, or had it been warm before she touched it? She wasn't sure. She thought about it briefly and found she couldn't reconstruct the sequence clearly enough to be certain. She looked at the locket. She thought about the woman in the photograph, about the initials on the back, LM, about the phrase, always and only. about the pot sealed carefully in wax and buried at a deliberate depth in the corner of this backyard, and how long it had been there, and who had put it there, and why. She thought all of this in the way you think about something when you're holding it, partially, intuitively, with your hands still engaged, and your analytical mind not yet fully in gear. And then, without having made a conscious decision to do so, without it feeling like a decision at all, feeling instead like the most natural continuation of a gesture already in progress, she reached up and clasped the necklace around her neck. The clasp closed with a small, precise click. The locket settled against her sternum, cool through the fabric of her shirt, and then, almost immediately, warm. The warmth was like the warmth of the soil had been, not dramatic, not alarming, simply the warmth of something alive. The warmth of something that had been cold for a very long time and was now, finally, against a living body. Hermione put her hand over it, flat against her chest, feeling its weight and warmth through the fabric. She sat on the porch for another minute, looking at the backyard, at the section she'd cleared, at the spade still standing in the soil of the far corner where she'd left it. Then she went inside to wash her hands and start the rest of her day. She did not take the necklace off. Ron noticed it at lunch. He'd been in the second bedroom, their designated office space, still chaotic with boxes, working on a client project. And he came out at noon to find Hermione making sandwiches in the kitchen, still in her garden clothes, her hands scrubbed clean, but with the particular under-the-nail darkness that garden work leaves that no amount of washing entirely removes. He saw the necklace when she turned to hand him his plate. He said, "That's new." She looked down at it, touched it with her fingertips. She had, he thought later, a slightly distracted quality in that moment, not absent exactly, but as if part of her attention was elsewhere, occupied by something. She said, "I found it in the backyard." He looked at it more closely. Old clearly. The tarnished silver, the fine chain, the oval locket. He said, "Found it how?" She told him about the pot, about digging and the resistance of the spade and the clearing of the soil around it. She described the wax seal and the degraded fabric inside and the necklace coiled on it. She told him about the initials and the photograph. He listened and looked at the necklace and said, "It was buried." She said, "Deliberately, not deep but deliberately." He considered this. He said, "That's a little strange." She said, "Old property, people bury things." He said, "People bury things they want to preserve or things they want to get rid of. Which do you think this was?" She looked at him for a moment, then at the locket. She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Should you be wearing it before you know?" She said, "Probably not," in a tone that meant she was going to keep wearing it. He looked at her with the expression he had when he knew he'd arrived at the edge of a conversation that Hermione had already decided the outcome of. He said, "Okay, but will you at least show me the pot?" After lunch, she showed him the pot, still on the back porch. He turned it over in his hands, examined the residue of the wax seal, pressed his thumb into the engraving on the base that they hadn't noticed before, a rough, hand-incised marking, not decorative, more like an identifier. He couldn't make out what it depicted. He set the pot down and looked at the corner of the yard where she'd found it, then at the necklace at her throat. He said, "You really think someone just left it there?" She said, "I think someone put it there. Whether they intended for someone to find it or whether they were trying to make sure no one did, I genuinely don't know." He looked at her. "Does it matter?" She touched the locket with her fingertips again, that gesture he'd already noticed, the reflexive checking of its presence. She said, "Probably." The afternoon passed ordinarily. Ron went back to his project. Hermione went back to the garden, a different section, not the corner, working along the south fence line. She worked until the light began to go, which at this time of year and in this valley happened earlier than she expected, the sun dropping behind the western ridge while there was still plenty of light in the sky above, plunging the yard into a premature dusk that had its own quality, amber, and still and slightly suspended, as if the day was pausing before it committed to ending. She came inside and showered, made dinner. They ate at the kitchen table they'd finally gotten set up, with the candles she'd found in a moving box and the good plates she'd wrapped so carefully in newspaper that unpacking them had felt like opening presents. They talked about Ron's project, about the truck situation, about the section of north fence that needed repairing, about the forsythia that needed serious attention before spring. Ordinary conversation, the texture of a shared life being built. Ron watched her during dinner with the attentiveness he'd always had the quality of paying close attention without appearing to. He noticed that she touched the locket 3 times during the meal, each time briefly, as if verifying. He noticed that she was slightly quieter than usual, not withdrawn, not absent, present in the conversation and engaged in it, but with something running underneath the engagement, some secondary process that her attention was partly on. He didn't say anything. He filed it. They did the dishes together, as they always did, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, because they were tired from days of physical work and the particular exhaustion of a new life being assembled from its components. Hermione fell asleep quickly. Ron lay awake for a while, as he had the night before, listening to the creak and the wind in the canopy and the occasional sound from the tree line that he still couldn't identify with certainty. He looked at the ceiling and thought about the pot and the necklace and the photograph of the woman with the hollow eyes, and decided that tomorrow he would look up the property records and find out something about who had lived here before them. He fell asleep with that intention in his mind, clear and organized, the way his intentions always were. He did not dream. Hermione did. The dream began the way the best and worst dreams begin, without announcement, without transition, simply the sudden absolute presence of a place that is not the place you fell asleep in. She was standing at the top of a staircase. Not the staircase in this house. This house had no staircase, being a single-story bungalow. This was a different house, larger, with a staircase that descended from a narrow landing into a ground-floor hallway that she could see partially from where she stood. Dark wood banister. Wallpaper, a faded pattern. Flowers on a pale ground, the kind of wallpaper that had been put up a long time ago and had been living with the slow indignity of its own fading ever since. The light was dim. Evening light, or the light of a house where the curtains are kept closed in rooms where they shouldn't be. She stood at the top of the staircase and looked down and felt, with the complete conviction of the dreaming mind, that she had been here before. Not in any waking life she could access, but before, in the deep way that some dreams insist upon, the way of things that feel more like memory than imagination. She went down the stairs. The hallway at the bottom was long and narrow, doors on either side all closed. The wallpaper continued down here, the same pattern, more faded. The floorboards were uneven, slightly warped, and they creaked under her feet with a sound that was not quite random. A sound that had a pattern to it, she thought, a sequence, as if the house was producing a specific progression of notes as she walked, the way an instrument produces specific notes depending on where it is played. She walked to the end of the hallway. There was a door. Not like the other doors, those were interior doors, light wood, ordinary. This door was heavier, set slightly back into the wall, dark wood, almost black, with a latch rather than a knob, a simple iron latch, the kind you lift to open. She stood in front of it. The locket at her throat was warm. She could feel it even in the dream, the specific warmth of it against her sternum, which was strange. She understood distantly, the way you understand things in dreams, because you don't usually feel physical sensations with this specificity in dreams. You don't usually feel the exact weight of a piece of jewelry and the exact temperature of it, the exact pressure of a chain against the back of your neck. She lifted the latch. The door opened. Behind it, stairs going down. A cellar staircase, steep and narrow, the wood of the treads worn smooth in the center with long use. The darkness below was not complete. There was a light source somewhere down there, something low and amber, barely enough to see by, but enough to show her the rough stone walls on either side of the stairs and the earthen floor at the bottom. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs, and looked down into the amber dark. And from below, from the cellar, from somewhere in that amber-lit darkness, from a source she could not see, came a voice. A woman's voice. Low, clear, with a quality she couldn't name, not distress exactly, not fear, but something underneath those things, something more fundamental. The voice of someone who has been waiting for a very long time and has stopped expecting the waiting to end, and has somehow, against all expectation, found that it has. The voice said one word. It said her name. Not Hermione, her name, her full name, the name she had been given and had carried all her life, and that only certain people used, the people who had known her long enough to earn it. The voice said her name, and then it said, very quietly, as if it understood that the saying of it was only a beginning. You came. Hermione woke at 3:47 in the morning. Not gradually. All at once, eyes open, completely awake, the dream still present with that particular vividness that fades in the first minutes of waking, that you know you must hold onto or lose. She lay still in the dark and held it. The cellar stairs, the amber light, the voice saying her name. Ron was asleep beside her, breathing steadily, deeply, undisturbed. She lay still for a long time. Then her hand moved to her throat, to the locket. She closed her fingers around it in the dark, feeling its weight, its warmth, the slight irregularity of the tarnished surface under her thumb. She lay there holding it and staring at the ceiling and listening to the creak and the wind and the distant tree line, and she told herself it was a dream. Just a dream. The ordinary processing of a day's discoveries by a sleeping brain, the necklace, the pot, the photograph, the old property, the corner of the yard where the soil was warm. The brain takes in what the day gives it and builds with the material overnight, and sometimes what it builds is vivid and convincing and feels like something more than what it is, and that feeling is not evidence of anything. She told herself this. She was a sensible person. She was a gardener, a person who dealt in soil and seed and the patient evidence of growing things. She believed in what she could put her hands on. She told herself it was a dream. She did not take the necklace off. And in the far right corner of the backyard, in the dark under the apple tree, in the soil that was warm in a way that had no adequate explanation, in the place where the pot had been buried decades ago by a person who was not here anymore, the earth settled, and was still, and waited.